Hello, Public to Pew listeners. This is Johnny Gwynn, co-host and producer of this show. Just a friendly reminder, Reverend Gibson's sermon will be on the very first part of the show. Then we'll have our intro music, and then our discussion will follow. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This past Sunday at Church Cathedral was another busy day. This time, recognizing our graduating high school seniors, along with the graduating seniors of the Mobile chapter of the Kappa League, welcoming the Murphy High School class of 1958, observing Beckwith Sunday, honoring our diocesan camp and conference center in Baldwin County, thanking our Christian formation teachers and helpers, and finally, enjoying the annual Cathedral family picnic. So we especially needed to hear the message of the Reverend Marshall Craver on this Sunday, guiding us through the gospel lesson from John, in which Jesus calls himself the true vine, of whom we are the branches. Our nature is to abide in the vine and to bear much good fruit. How we do this, or not, was the subject of Marshall's sermon. Marshall began with an illustration from a moment earlier in his week. As he was driving from Mobile to Defuniak Springs, Florida, to keep an appointment with a clergy person, he found that he was running a little bit late and that he had not filled his gas tank quite full enough. And so a sign appeared for him on his dashboard, the red gas indicator light. And when that sign appeared, he began to pray. His prayer was, "Please, God, please, God, please, God." Of course, please let me get there. The answer to his prayer came, he said, not in getting there without running out of gas, but in an awareness of the tip of a more significant spiritual iceberg. We all try to push too far, too fast, too much under the power of our own steam. We believe that we can run our tanks of energy and awareness and ability past all the indicators, past all the red lights, past all the warnings, and somehow emerge okay. Without awareness or consideration, we assume that all our doing, our getting things done, is all that matters, and that there is no other reality. Following the tip of the iceberg a bit further down, we realize that there are no random floating pieces of ice like that. There are no chance things in our lives, no accidents that happen in this way. In all things, God is speaking. Indeed, God is in all things. So how about all our doing? Marshall took us back to the origins of philosophical thought in the West. Plato presented a universe in which being, or essence, the ideal form, is the true reality. Later, Aristotle asserted that action, doing, was the location of true reality. To be or to do, which is fundamental, and so on throughout our history. Christianity, in its roots, offers us an organic view of these questions. Doing emerges like a plant from seed or rootstock, from being. Our relationship with God is mutual and organic. Our being flows from the divine being, emerging into the world of action and returning again to its source. Our gospel reading this Sunday gives us an image for this. Jesus says in John's gospel, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit, and throws it into the fire to be burned. Every branch that bears fruit he will prune, so that it will bear more." Our role as the branches is to bear much good fruit, and we must abide in the vine in order to do that. If we consider ourselves as we're depicted in this image, we see that we are meant to bear the fruit of the Spirit, and that we can only do this in healthy life that flows from the vine. Abiding in the vine means living or resting in God, living with awareness of God's love as the thing that flows through us and through our actions into the world, and observing the Sabbath that God commands in order to come to that awareness. Sabbath, our English word for the Hebrew Shabbat, comes from the same root, shan baitav, to cease, to end, to rest. The branches that are cast into the fire shows us what happens when we don't do that, We are burned. Burnout is the term we use to refer to what happens to us as caregivers for young and old and sometimes for groups, as teachers with students, as doctors and nurses with patients, as business people caring for companies and work, and yes, even as clergy. Marshall spoke of the term used in the Quaker tradition, centering down into God, as a way of considering our need for Sabbath rest. Resting in God not only on the seventh or the Sabbath day, but throughout every day and in all of our dealings. We have been planted, we have grown out of the vine, not to be annuals, but to be perennials, bearing fruit that lasts.
Welcome to Pulpit to Pew, a podcast that features a conversation between priest and parishioner to understand how the message translates and to further explore the weekly lessons within the Episcopal tradition and daily life. The Very Reverend Beverly Gibson, Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, and Johnny Gwynn, a newcomer to the Episcopal family, discuss what Beverly intended and Johnny heard, or got wrong.
We've all had our please God incidents or
Please
incident.
God, just let me.
Right.
Just let me get out of it this time.
And it's mundane stuff too. I mean, that's well, it's not mundane because he might be going to the most important meeting of his life. And again, you've put yourself in that situation.
Well, you did it. You left home late. You didn't put gas in the tank. I did it just this morning. Please God, let me get there no more than 5 minutes late.
Right.
So, and I'm trying to remember how exactly did he transitioned that with the awareness that came. The answer to the prayer was not getting him there. The answer to the prayer was the awareness of our own inevitable deficiency in getting ourselves wherever we're going through our doing.
Right. He brought up Buechner, which I spelled Frederick Buechner. Theologian, correct, and an author.
Theologian and writer.
I think it went to the idea of like, there's no chance things in life. We find God, we find the divine in everyday life. Right. So the idea of that little bitty moment of the gas tank going on empty and all these things going through your brain and like, oh God, and then calling God's help to this little mundane thing. Really, that's where the juice is. That's where the fruit is. It's in everyday life. Right. That's where God is. And we might miss it if we're so overwhelmed. We're not getting the presence.
If we don't have that awareness. And it's not like Marshall was saying, God decided that on that day he was going to make Marshall not do this so that then he could. But it emerges, as everything does, out of our being. Mm-hmm. That in what we do, in all the things that happen around us and to us, God is present, God is there. And it's in our awareness of that, in our observation of it, that we become aware of our connection to the divine. And that's, I think, where...
and also how we rely on him, though, too. The reliance on him as well, right? Or am I jumping through something that you didn't want me to jump into?
We'll talk a little more about that. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, God's in everything. We say that, but in those little moments, he says, please God. Like, that's the only choice he's got because he has left everything to chance because he was overwhelmed in life. He didn't get gas. Well, it comes down to like, this is my only hope. But the thing is, we shouldn't keep it. It shouldn't be that way, I guess. But that sounds really bad, actually.
It does, but God didn't stretch out the amount of gas in his tank. I mean, it could have just as easily run out of gas and been left by the side of the road.
But because of our inherent human flaws, God has to be there to make amends, to make things atone for our flaws.
Well, I do think that God is there with us, and whether we run out of gas or don't, God is present. I think where Marshall was going with this was to say we have to be able to, in his term, to fall back, to center down into God, to some awareness of why we find ourselves in this situation to start with.
Right.
And how is it that we can be living our lives in greater and deeper awareness on a daily basis. Does that make sense?
Well,
and we are relying on God for that. We are.
But I mean, my gosh, how many shows have we talked about presence? Like, quit being inundated in that carousel of the present, past, future when you're working with long-term goals and career stuff and life and everything's taken over and you're not even realizing the beauty in the moment of the time. Right. And that's where God could be. And you're so busy, you're missing all of it because you're not listening, you're not seeing. And that we end up in that mass jumbled bit of nerves and stress and energy. God is in the silence, and we don't take that silence.
Right. Well, and also that we get caught up in that. I can do this. I can do this. I can do this.
Add another thing to the list.
And let me just put this on there. Let me do this too. I can, and I did that with my day to day. I can be here. I can be there. I can, and maybe not. How well can I do that? How present will I be when I do that? How useful am I going to be in the places that I arrive if I'm doing that? Marshall's teaching, I think, was to help us see that being more present, being more useful, being more fully who we're meant to be comes from that abiding in the vine, comes from that resting back in the center that we emerge from. That's a cultivated piece of awareness. It comes through prayer. It comes through a refusing sometimes to do.
Learning when to say no.
Right.
Yeah.
To say, no, I'm not all my doing, and I don't need to be in all of these places today. And it all doesn't rely on me and my getting there in this particular place, in this particular time. It actually will be okay some other way.
Well, I looked at some of the stuff like the being and the doing stuff because there's a being and the doing side on the psychology side of stuff a lot, like knowing the self and, kind of productivity. But I looked up being and doing with the idea of theology or divinity, and there is a biblical direction of the idea of being and doing, because when we get in the trap of the doing, there's like that's serving, but being is abiding. It went to this whole thing of like it's not the same, people. And we just talked about actions and truth last week. Last episode was like the example of God is, or love is an action and truth, which kind of a contradictory message a little bit. This when I read it a little bit was like sometimes doing, even though that's important, gets in the way of actually your relationship with God, because you're just doing, you're trying to save the world. And it's kind of like the idea of when Judas got all angry at Mary Magdalene about the nard on his feet, and he was like, "We could have sold that for 300 whatever to feed the poor." And Jesus said, "Hey, you don't get me forever. This is." You're going to enjoy me now.
This is an act of love on her part.
Right. And so I thought that was reminded me of that being and doing thing. There's time to, yes, do all these things to take on causes and stuff, but are these causes just you doing the actions and doing so many things you're really not even figuring out the purpose and your connection with God and these things you're doing?
Right. And that's one of the traps of Christian living on an individual basis and also as Christian communities, because we get caught up with the notion that we need to do more, and that the measure of our faith or the measure of our goodness as Christians, as though there is some measure of that, has to do with how much we do. I mean, what do we do for the poor?
Right.
What do we do in our community? And we have all kinds of church words for that, outreach and all sorts of things like that, as though we can make up our minds what those things need to be, and then our doing of them is simply good in and of itself.
Yeah.
I have even heard people say, and not necessarily people who are embedded in a Christian community, but who have some problem with being embedded in a Christian community, will say, I'm just not all about this spiritual stuff and this prayer and all that. I just want to do good.
Right.
Well, there are 501c3s out there all over the place. And there are lots of ways to do things in your community, but we are about that abiding, that this flows out of our spiritual connection with God and our physical connection with God too, by the way. But it has to begin with the right relationship, and it has to flow out of our hearts and our minds and our love of God. And if it doesn't emerge from that sort of naturally and organically, then it gets caught up in all this ego stuff and many false assumptions. And so I think that's why this image is so very powerful.
Right.
That we are the branches of the vine, and if we're not healthy in our connection with the vine, then we're going to get burned, right?
Or not grow.
Right, or not grow. Yeah. It's not going to work if we're not rooted in that way, and that's the basis. That's where it all begins. And that's where it has its essence, its nature, its and you can't shortcut around that.
Right. I think I go to the point of, and companies do this too, when they have visions, right? Or corporate vision, and then they set up quotas for certain things like, we were going to collect 1,000 pounds of canned goods, right? And it's all about that stupid meter on the wall, but not while you're doing it, right? And then everyone gets so wrapped into the doing, not into the being of what the importance of that is, right? And you forget the whole vision of why you were doing it. And I guess that's the idea of like, if the actions don't have love behind it, it's half.
Right. Or it's not healthy enough to thrive.
Right.
And
or it might run out once you hit 1,000. We're done.
We're done.
We're done.
Over.
And look what we did. Yay. And then we pat ourselves on the back. And the idea is like, how does that perennial, not annual, keep bearing, create a system where we are not just going, let's put a quota. Maybe the idea is like, we are always doing these collections because the idea of it drives us, it does something for us, and we know that it goes to a larger purpose.
Well, and think about organizations do this all the time. Businesses do it. Churches do it. We get ahead of ourselves. We have a base idea, right? And then we build a structure all on top of it. Without a foundation, without a way of supplying the energy and the real life that will help this to live, survive, thrive, be out in the world for the long term, and then those things fail.
Right.
And then we wonder why it failed, because it has to be sustainable. Right. It has to be tied to something that gives it life. And we're all about the upper structure, and we're not so much about the deep part.
And that's usually the hardest building part, is those first ground floors. Everybody wants to build 4, 5, 6, 7 in the penthouse. But if you didn't set up the bottom, the basement, if the basement is not made correctly, it's all going to come a-crumbling. It's a short-lived building.
Well, think about the huge new skyscraper that's in New York City now on Park Avenue. Think about how deeply that must go into the earth.
Yeah.
If you've been to the 9/11 memorial underneath the Twin Towers, then you realize just how, because it takes you all the way down. And it's a moving experience to go that far down and realize, what was underneath those buildings, and it all came down to the underneath. And so building shows us this, nature shows us this, and yet somehow or other we think that in the living of our daily lives, that's not the case. It doesn't pertain.
Well, you're not in the present. Everyone's going to like, oh, that finish line is going to feel so good. Right. When you're like, no, you're on mile 5 of the marathon. You need to realize you might trip over that pothole right there. And we, again, I don't want us to sound like we're saying charity is bad. If you're doing something for others, that's a step in the right direction. But the idea is it a 1-month project or is it a lifelong pursuit?
Right. And charity, remember, means love.
Okay. So that's a root word.
Right. That is the root of the word.
All these semantics.
These three abide, right? Faith, hope, and charity. Love. So that what we give is love.
Okay.
I mean, it may be our love in a tangible form, but that's what we're giving, is our love and our care, our belief that others are in need of the same opportunities that we've been given, our belief that all people have the same dignity and therefore should not be without certain essential things in life. It flows from that and not from our own sense of noblesse oblige or knowing what's best for another person.
Right. I'm here to save the day. You're not Superman. You're right.
I'm going to bestow this on you because I'm better than you are.
Or making up for something, thinking this makes up for something you've done in the past that you haven't let go yet.
Right.
Because, I know that's something, and that's just human nature. But that you kind of grow up as kids doing that. You did something wrong at the household, so you do extra chores to think you're going to make that all better, right? But the idea is we have to grow up in our mentality as humans to get wiser and wiser and wiser. The idea is like things in the past are in the past. You either atone for them, you ask for forgiveness or not. But your actions in the future sometimes doesn't change what that was in the back.
Right. And this is territory that the 12-step methods have mined very deeply and very well in terms of going back to make amends. And that's the word that they use for that. And it doesn't undo anything that you have done, but it does acknowledge. And that's a basic spiritual movement, to acknowledge one's wrongdoing and to attempt to make amends and to say, I was wrong, I hurt you, I acknowledge that. Is there any way now that I can extend a love towards you that I did not extend then? Knowing that it won't undo that, but hoping that you will see that I value you now, that I'm aware.
And I hear growth in that. We talk about vines that bear perennial fruit. Well, that's growth. I mean, if someone was to say, that same person that didn't take that idea of at least saying, I take ownership of that, I'm asking for forgiveness. Now, what that person does on the other side, either takes it or doesn't, that's kind of out of your hands at that point.
Right.
But the idea is, if the person said, instead of that, said, hey, that happened so long ago, why do you still care about that? It almost, you're not growing as a person. You need to, that's, to me, says not, that vine has been cut. Because you're cutting things off, where that growth that's there is thinking, I am connected to my past. I'm not going to say, in crime, when you statute of limitations, certain things don't have statute of limitations on certain sins, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think they're not statutes of limitations on that. But, this is also, I think, related to the topic that Marshall really dwelt on for quite some time, and that is burnout.
Caregiver burnout. That's a real thing. I looked it up, and it's not a religious term. It has to do with people that go and take care of elderly and the disabled. There's page after page of like, this is very important, people. If you love your job, if you don't take the time to do these 6 things, you are not going to be doing your job very long in the caregiving business.
Right. Well, and it extends beyond the caregiving business as well. And he went on to say, it's true for parents of children. It's true for any of us in our work, the care and tending of a business, the care and tending of a vocation. We can ignore all of the warning signs that tell us that we have to back off, that we have to connect to something deeper, that we have to tie this into something that will energize us, that we have to rest. Our culture doesn't really value rest. We talk about recreation, which is another way of consuming and doing.
Right. Let's go to Disney World and rest.
Let's go spend some money. Let's go take an incredibly active vacation and spend a ton of money while we do it, and because it feeds the machine.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily feed us. And so when we talk about rest, we're talking about something really different. We're not talking about a vacation. We're not talking about recreation. We're talking about those things that have in many studies been demonstrably shown to actually make us healthier, and that is the attention to our own spiritual lives and well-being, the ability to rest and be with our families. I mean, just to be and not do for a bit.
A battery can't run forever. Right, it's got to be recharged.
Right, to play in a way that's not necessarily consumer-driven. All of those things, to be in relationship with other people, to eat meals with other people, and if you think about the long tradition of Shabbat and of Sabbath, that's what that's about. It's unplugging.
Right.
It's being at table. It's being in relationship with your spouse, with your family, and that is that renewing rest. And we don't do that well.
I have been terrible. My Sundays have been so busy that I'm going to church because it's very important to me to do that, certain things. But, it starts a path at 11:30. I have been doing one thing after the other. And I've had to tell myself, this is going to stop at some point. Now, I haven't said when, but it throws off things because I am not getting, it's a centering down thing, which I read about that. It's a Quaker. It almost sounds like meditation because it's the idea of like palms down first. So you let go. Is that what that is? Letting go of your stress and your loneliness and your depression.
It's the body experience of prayer.
And then the hands up, palms up means I'm ready to receive God. And I can't remember rest. The last thing is once you're done praying, after you have opened yourself up to hearing and listening, the last part is sitting in silence to literally, you're not even praying or thinking. It literally is, you're taking in the moment, which I thought was very interesting.
The practice of silence, and it is a practice, is essential to the Quaker movement. But if you think about it, it's part of every spiritual tradition. It's part, certainly, of the Buddhist tradition. It's deep within the Christian tradition. And I think we're only in the late 20th and now into our century really reclaiming the practice of centering prayer or contemplative awareness as part of the Christian tradition. After the passing of monasticism in its big form, we tended to leave that behind as a church, and we became more focused on some of the other things that you and I have talked about on forms and doing and action and all of that sort of thing. And prayer as something discursive or something that you do. rather than prayer being something or being, right? You're being in the presence of God.
Like when we talked about this when I asked how could you make your Lenten experience or Easter experience a little more special this year, and you said, why don't you go into the park and put a picnic or a blanket down and literally sit for 20 minutes. Yeah. Hey, do what you want with it, but when do you get a chance to do that? And that's that finding yourself connected. And I think Marshall said, because we talked about I am the true vine and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. And then he said that is the saying of the mutual organic relationship that flows from our being. Well, if you go into nature, sit there, don't turn on the iPhone, don't do anything, and sit there and ground yourself to the world and look at the beauty of that. That could be one of those spiritual moments, how it's all connected, how we are bigger than ourselves and how this all works together. And that's those things of much more than like a ritual or formulaic prayer. You start feeling connected to the world and to the things around you. That is pretty metaphysical. That's big and strong.
It is, and it's directly tied to your body, your physical being, and it reinforces the truth that we are not just our minds, that we're not some kind of ethereal sort of thing trapped in a body, that we are creatures.
Right.
And that all of our creatureliness is tied to God. And so your presence in nature, for however many minutes you're able to do that, giving up your thoughts, give up those little running trains of stuff you're going to do or stuff you did do.
And it takes a while to get there.
It's hard to get there.
Because if you say, I'm going to give myself 5 minutes, it's going to take you much longer than that to get
your head to shut up.
Like you said, I love that thought of the train running in the head. And eventually the train will, I don't quite hear it so much. But to get that true moment of silence. And I have a lot of friends that practice transcendental meditation. It takes them years to do five true minutes of it. Years to get there.
Well, if you think about, to go back to the Buddhist tradition and their practice of sitting, that is a lifetime's work to be able to sit in that way. And even in the Christian tradition also, for prayer of this sort, the understanding is this is not at that level about you.
Right.
It's about the world. And that sense of your connectedness to the world is deeply, deeply important.
Yeah.
And it gets you away from your ego stuff, from your head stuff, from your sense of the absolute be-all, end-all importance of what you're going to do this afternoon.
Yeah.
And to a different sense of your embeddedness in all of this. We've talked before about the web, that web of creation that we live in. And that kind of practice can make you more aware of your presence in that web and the web's presence in you. And I think all of these things are what Marshall is getting at when he talks about centering down, about resting, about abiding, is being sensitive to that connection and not so caught up in the freneticness of what we're going to accomplish or what we're going to do.
And the modern world, we're so scared of silence. We're so scared.
It's very hard to find.
Because when we have it, it's like something's off because we're so not, TV's on in the background or the earbuds on or all those things. But to have true silence, it makes us feel like, wait, what's wrong? Like, what's broken? And to be able to understand, you have to work through the uncomfort, that alienness to get to no, this is supposed to be this way.
This is the thing.
This is actually the really nice thing of what if you could find time to get this to 10, 15 minutes a week and understand, get past the strangeness of it and find the serenity of it. Well, in church, you can't do that because we worship together.
Right.
And this sounds like a very personal, intimate thing.
This is. And church is a different experience. Our worship but it is meant in a liturgical church like ours, it is meant to put you in a different rhythm.
Like communal, to me, because we say things together, we sing together. We don't speak in tongues. We don't have that, there's that moment of so-and-so having their moment with God. Ours is actually as a body.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, there are plenty of traditions, and you know plenty about this, where making sounds or rrhythms is a part of prayer, or drumming or humming
chanting,
or chanting.
Monastic chants. Yeah.
Right. All of those things are ways of coming to this kind of awareness that we're talking about too. And I think there's a certain amount of that in our liturgical practice, in being in the room with other bodies, that we're all embodied in this space together. We're all saying these things together. We're singing together. These same sound waves are moving across all of our bodies. That is the physical aspect of our worship that also connects us to these things.
Like a tree, like the vine. I mean, we are the branches. It all springs up from the vine, which is tended by the vine grower, which is God. I mean, and we don't turn the hierarchy upside down. It doesn't become we become the center of this. We are literally a part of it, and it's a active and vital part. Right. But it's symbiotic. But still obedient. Like we don't jump. We don't become the vine grower.
We don't. And that passage does also say that even if you're bearing fruit, you're going to get pruned, right, so that you will bear more fruit.
Which is really interesting, because that goes to the idea of learning how to say no. Well, the vine grower has to cut the limbs that are dying to make the ones that are fruitful more robust, and that can fall in. I can see where religions and people could use that as how to excommunicate things.
Oh yeah, well that we become the one who decides that you're not healthy.
Right? Yeah, for the health of the tree, let's get rid of this branch because of whatever reason, right? Again, that's the thing of the beautifulness of a line in the Bible can be altered a little bit, because it's against the interpretation of something like that. And you're talking about something that's very natural. I mean, the gardener has to prune to have perennial growth, and it's not very prudent if they don't do that. And I don't know. I'm sorry I locked into that. Just remind me of that, because it can sound the harshness of religion. He prunes those that do not bear fruit.
Right. Well, yeah, it does have that. And cast into the fire has other image connotations too. This makes me think, though. In our travels this past summer, we visited Hampton Court, England, and there at Hampton Court, huge gardens all around, and there is the oldest vine in England. And it's actually growing, and the fruit is growing. The branches are growing, and the fruit are growing inside this greenhouse. And it goes round and round and round and round in there. It's very healthy looking. But there's this huge plot of ground outside of there where there's nothing growing, and you can't see anything. But there's a little sign that says, "These are the roots."
Growing that big thing.
Growing that thing in there. And it's probably, at least the part you can see, half an acre.
Yeah.
And all of this stuff under the ground that you don't see is feeding that vine that's in there.
That goes to the tip of the iceberg that Marshall brought up. It was like, you only see that glacier in the water, but it's that famous picture of it goes down 2 miles. Again, the perception reality thing. We think we've just got such a great grasp on reality.
I see it,
and it's all just a theater and an illusion.
You have no idea what's underneath.
And I think the largest organism in the world is like this mushroom meshed underneath the ground that grows up. It's like 30 miles. It's a living thing.
There was an X-Files about that, wasn't there?
Of course, sure it was.
I remember that.
But it's a really nice message, though. I mean, and I love that be a perennial, not an annual, which is such a good Southern. I can hear a Southern grandmother say that. But I mean, to bear fruit with the idea of there isn't a beginning and an ending. It's the idea of working towards a life that is constantly, sustainably being fruitful in the world, based on the idea of where we know our nourishment comes from.
Right. And that's a pretty countercultural idea, if you get right down to it, because we are very much a disposable culture.
Correct.
The sense that you're going to have something in your life that you care for, that you tend, that you want to pass on to people that you will never know. And that's very much a part of our life in the church. It can be very much a part of our individual lives. We talked before about planting seeds, doing something that lasts, that's going to last beyond you and beyond this present reality. And we're talking about that idea in a different way this time.
Well, this was a really good, I really loved this Reverend Craver's sermon this week. It was really good. And I really like the vine and the vine grower. Again, I want to see a Venn diagram of how it all works together, but it was a really nice Sunday. And I wish I had more time to rest on Sunday, but I went straight to work at 12:01 right after work.
Well, I'll tell you.
And I missed fried chicken that we had at the picnic.
The fried chicken was good. And that's true for clergy. Sunday is not a day of rest.
Right.
Obviously, it's a work day. But the challenge then is to find some other time that becomes your Sabbath. That is that, because not thinking of it just as a seventh day, but as rest, as stillness, as stopping. And to find that a little bit every day, a block every week is necessary.
Those are wise words we will leave on today. This has been Pulpit to Pew, and I'm Johnny Gwynn.
I'm Beverly Gibson.
And Beverly will end on your final word.
Amen.
If you'd like to know more about Beverly Gibson and Christ Church Cathedral, please visit christchurchcathedralmobile.org. There you'll find information on the church, Reverend Beverly Gibson's recorded sermons, and sermon notes. If you want to know more about Johnny and his Sabbadoodles, visit pulpittopew.com. I would also like to thank Deep Fried Studios and producer Stacy Wellborn. Without her, this show would not get made. If you have any comments, likes, dislikes, please send information to Stacy at deepfriedstudios.com. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for listening.